on YouTube.
Oh, well, there we go. Welcome to Sociology 101. This is Leighton Flowers with Texas Baptist, as many of you know. I am the director of director of evangelism and apologetics for Texas Baptist, and we have a guest with us today. Okay, we're good to go. So, all right. I'll mute it from the other side. This is the joy of doing live broadcasting, is that you're learning how it works as you go. And I'm using Zoom for the first time in a live broadcast. And so Dr. Tim Stratton is with us with Free Thinking Ministries. Welcome, Tim, to the program. Appreciate you coming on.
Oh man, it's an honor, Leighton. I've looked up to you for a long time, and you're doing great work. You've sharpened me along the way. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be on your show. Thanks for having me.
Well, brother, I've been listening to some of your interactions with mutual friends. I know that you were on David Wood's program the other day. Yeah. I think you've talked with Mike Winger before in the past, and you've talked to Eli Ayala. Mm-hmm. I don't know why I can't get his name out the right time. Forgive me, Eli. I know he'll probably watch this too, and he did. Y'all did a great job, and he's one of our mutual Calvinistic friends. And so I wanted you on because you do a really good job of explaining Molinism. I've reached out to Dr. Craig a couple of times, and we might be able to get together. And I'd love to have Dr. Craig on the program one day to talk through this. Of course, we both look up to him a lot.
That's right.
And he does a great job. But sometimes bringing the cookies down on the bottom shelf, as I've heard you put it before, is important. And I think you do a really good job of that when it comes to Molinism, because let's just be honest, it's pretty deep philosophical waters. Right. Yep. And so sometimes when we hear some of the things being said by Molinists, it can be kind of confusing. And I've even heard people say, well, it's just a Calvinism light, or it's just like Calvinism. It's the same as Calvinism. And so some people dismiss it because of that. But let me just say that even traditionalists or provisionists like myself, the author of the traditionalist statement, Eric Hankins, is a self-proclaimed Molinist. Yeah. So Molinism is not in contrast with provisionism or traditionalism. Right. In fact, I think, Dr. Stratton, you would say even that it's not in contrast really with the core root of Calvinism in itself, at least the mere form of Molinism, as I really want you to explain to our audience. Right. I've never proclaimed to agree with Molinism because I've always said I think it's a sufficient but not necessary philosophical answer to a problem that the Bible really doesn't address in specific, in my opinion. But maybe you'll convince me today. Who knows?
Yeah, we'll see. Let's see what happens.
let's work through this. So explain to us what is Molinism, even mere Molinism, as you've explained it before. Help our audience to understand it.
Yeah, well, mere Molinism, as opposed to just Molinism, is, I say that it entails two essential ingredients. And so that's just one, that logically prior to God's decision to create the world, that God knew everything that would happen in any possible scenario he could create or that he could actualize. Now, if that's true, then God's got middle knowledge. And the second essential ingredient here is that as beings created in the image of God, that humans, like God, possess libertarian freedom. And by that, what does libertarian freedom mean? Because that can mean different things to different people, and there can be a long conversation on that. But I define libertarian freedom, that an agent has libertarian freedom if this agent is not always causally determined to think and act, and possesses the ability to choose between a range of options, each compatible with one's nature. Right. So let me say that again. Those are two essential ingredients. One, logically prior to God's decision to create the world, that God knew everything that would happen in any possible scenario he could create. That entails middle knowledge. And two, as beings created in the image of God, humans like God possess libertarian freedom. So basically it comes down to God's got middle knowledge and humans have libertarian freedom. And I say that one can move beyond mere Molinism and apply these two essentials to soteriological issues, which I'll say, hey, I do that, but it's not necessary. You don't have to do that, but you can become a soteriological Molinist if you affirm those two essential ingredients and add one more, and that's this, that God is a maximally great being who loves and desires the best for all people. And I say that once you affirm all three of those things, you'll have soteriological Molinism. But for my Calvinist friends, if they, you know, they might want to reject applying Molinism to soteriological issues. And if that's the case, then you can still keep the two essential ingredients, or what I call the two pillars of mere Molinism.
Okay, so let me give some clarification, because I think that the libertarian free will definition really gets to kind of the root of some of the differences of opinion between the different camps. And I like your definition, because you talk about how it's the ability to choose within the range of options that's consistent with your image of God nature.
Yeah, and I like to use the word compatible.
Okay,
right? They're consistent and compatible with your image of God nature.
So, for example, if your nature is corrupt, you can still choose between stealing the candy bar or the Coca-Cola.
That's right.
In other words,
you can choose to rob the bank or the liquor store.
Right. Or if you're a good person, you can choose between the red Bible or the blue Bible, as I've used the illustration before.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And so, because that is consistent or compatible with your given nature.
Right.
And that's all that's needed to establish libertarian free will, because you're ultimately saying God has not determined, i.e., sovereignly decreed before the creation of the world, that you're going to choose the blue Bible over the red Bible, or that He's going to make or causally determine the robber to steal rob the liquor store versus the bank, but that instead that is a range of options that's consistent with that person's nature, whatever it may be.
Right. A lot of times when I argue for libertarian freedom, I might be using libertarian freedom as an apologetic to show that God exists, and I do that quite a bit. But then I'll have somebody in the church stand up and say, no, we don't have the freedom to choose God. And I'll say, well, look, that's a different question, a different conversation. Even if it's true that you might not have the freedom to choose God, does that mean you can't choose to read a blue Bible or a red Bible? Does that mean that you cannot choose to, to sin or to take the way of escape that God promises to provide for Christians anyway? I mean, as long as you've got a range of options, each compatible with one's nature at a given time, then you have libertarian freedom. And the key word there is compatible, because a lot of Calvinists and determinists like to refer to something called compatibilistic freedom. And they'll say, well, you only choose what's compatible with your nature. And I say, well, why assume that there's only one option compatible with your nature? Mm-hmm. That's quite an assumption. And I think that will lead to big rationality problems down the line. After all, if one only chooses, can only choose one thing that's always based on their greatest desire, which is based on their nature, which is not up to them, then that means your thoughts and beliefs are never aimed at truth. They're always aimed at your desire. And why assume that your desires are true? So it's the same rationality problem for different reasons. I think, when Alvin Plantinga brings his evolutionary argument against naturalism, he shows that, hey, if evolution and naturalism is true, then your beliefs aren't ultimately aimed at truth, they're aimed at survival. Well, I say the same thing to the Calvinistic compatibilist. I'll say, well, if your view is true, then your beliefs aren't aimed at truth, they're aimed at your greatest desires, which is determined by your nature, which is determined by something other than you. So you lose epistemic grounds to rationally affirm your beliefs, including your belief that Calvinism or compatibilism is true.
Right. Which I've always likened that to animal instinct. An animal, a carnivorous lion is the example I've used, that they're going to quote unquote choose to eat meat over grass. But that's not really a moral choice,
or a rational one. Yeah.
Right. Because they're making an instinctive, it's more of an instinctive reaction to the environment, the stimuli in the environment. And that's ultimately what it seems like compatibilists have reduced moral choice to, because you're ultimately making a decision based upon your greatest preset desire within circumstances that are beyond your control. And so the way that I've talked about libertarian freedom, and it sounds consistent with what you're saying, is that it's a self-determined choice. In other words, you're the origin of your choice.
That's part of it.
Right. So, but sometimes I think the confusion is is that libertarian freedom is just the ability to do other than what you did.
That's right.
Like if it was a DVR and you replayed it over and over and over again, you could replay life and you could back up and replay that thing. Then one time you might do it, and one time you might not do it, and one time you might do it. And that seems irrational to people.
Yeah.
Or they'll say, well, God knows what you're going to do, and therefore you can't do other than what he knows. Otherwise you're nullifying God's knowledge. And then therefore they think that they have nullified libertarian free will because you can't do other than what God knows you would do, or knows you will do in a situation. But the way you've defined it, I think, helps to clarify libertarian freedom from our perspective, to say that's not what we're not trying to say you can do other than what God knows you will do. We're trying to say you can make a choice within a range of options that are compatible or consistent, however you want to put that, within your nature.
Yeah, I like to call myself a libertarian compatibilist. And so that really confuses traditional compatibilists out there. Like, no, compatibilism is determinism. And I'll say, well, but compatibilism also works on, you can be a libertarian compatibilist because you never choose. Even the libertarian doesn't think you can choose things that are incompatible with your nature. We just argue and demonstrate that there's times when you have two or more options that are each compatible with your nature at that given time. And so if that's the case, then you've got libertarian freedom. And that is a form of the PAP, or the principle of alternative possibilities. But even if for some strange reason, we don't always have that PAP ability, or that ability to do otherwise, even if you're an uncaused agent and nothing is causally determining you directly or indirectly, then you've still got libertarian freedom, even if for some strange reason there's only one thing you can choose that's compatible with your nature at the time.
Well, and I've pointed that out a lot too, that sometimes when I'm talking to Calvinists or other philosophical determinists, wherever they may stand on the spectrum, they seem to think that if they can show us one time where a person, it doesn't make a libertarian free choice, that they've proven libertarian freedom is wrong. But that's not at all. Actually, the opposite is true. If I can show you one libertarianly free choice, then I have established that it's rational and possible.
That's exactly right. I affirm the traditional compatibilistic view sometimes. I think when I go to the restaurant and I sit down and I look at the menu, I'm trying to see what is my greatest desire at this time. And that's what I always order, you know. But I show that can't apply universally across the board, especially when it comes to rationality and morality. Rational and moral decisions are much different than what you choose when you go to the restaurant off the menu.
So when we talk about the ability to do otherwise, for example, using the example, the blue Bible versus the red Bible, if I chose the red Bible, the PAP, the principle of other alternatives there, is that I could have chosen the other Bible. Or if I'm as a Christian, I fall into temptation, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, I could have resisted. God did provide me a way out. And so that would be a principle of alternatives that I have there. I have that ability to do otherwise. But what we're also saying is that in any choice, whether it's the blue versus the red versus, the liquor store versus the bank, whatever those are, as long as it's compatible with your nature, and there are true alternatives, and you're the one who's determining it. In other words, you haven't been determined by a quote unquote sovereign decree. In other words, God hasn't said, I have determined for him to choose the blue Bible, not the red Bible. Then that would qualify as a libertarian free choice, a choice that you're accountable for, so to speak.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah. I think we're on the same page there.
Okay. Now, one of the things that I run into quite a bit in these discussions is I run into some Calvinists like Chris Date, for example, maybe even Eli, others that we've talked to on the program before, who are consistent compatibilists, philosophical compatibilists, and they understand what theistic determinism is, and they affirm theistic determinism. They say, yes, as you refer to it as exhaustive divine determinism, EDD. They understand that, they affirm it, they say, yes, we hold to that. And those are the kinds of folks that I can talk to and feel like, okay, these guys at least are on the same page with me when we're talking and disagreeing with each other, because they're affirming what I think John Calvin most likely affirmed in his book on predestination for the most part.
He kind of talked out of both sides of his mouth.
Yeah, that's why I said for the most part, because there
right.
were times where you could take quotes out of other parts where it doesn't sound like he's affirming EDD.
I'll tell you this,
where he does.
In my dissertation, I've included some block quotes from Calvin, where I'm like, well, if you take this, he's affirming libertarian freedom as I've defined it here. The way I've defined libertarian freedom earlier today, he makes statements that are consistent with that. But then you read other things, and he's like, well, okay, now it's not so clear. But I think it depends on the day that you talk to him. And I also think if you would have got, say, Molina and Calvin in the same room, that they would have wound up agreeing with each other. And I think he would have probably said, oh, that's how we can make sense of that. But that's sorry to interrupt there.
Even the London Baptist Confession, chapter 9, which is based on the Westminster, of course, on the chapter 9 is the chapter on free will. And the first 2 points verify a liberty of the will that's not bound by nature to choose to sin or not to sin, to follow God or not to follow God, that they're mutable, they're able to fall, which seems to me to fit my understanding of libertarian freedom quite perfectly.
Yep, that's exactly right. If you ever have 2 options, at least 2 options or more that are each compatible with one's nature, then you've got libertarian freedom.
Okay, so when we're talking about blue Bibles and red Bibles, who cares? When we're talking about whether the robber robs the bank or the liquor store, that really doesn't get to the soteriological issues. The reason that you talk about those things, I think, are really important, because you're establishing the rationality of libertarian freedom and Molinism in general. But let's move into, really what Soteriology 101 is about, with regard to the main choice of all choices, the choice to believe and to trust in Jesus when the gospel is presented to you. And that's really where Calvinism, fleshes itself out. And so there are some Calvinists who do affirm libertarian free will in the way that you have just described it.
That's right.
Help me understand, and I know you've talked to, based upon your other interviews with Greg Koukl and other very intelligent men who are 5-point Calvinists, but still who affirm your understanding of libertarian freedom. How and why do they do that? And why wouldn't they just drop TULIP if they're going to affirm that libertarian free choices are rational?
Yeah, I mean, well, first, I just want to say that I'm always happy to meet a Calvinist who rejects, what I call exhaustive divine determinism, or ED. Got to avoid ED. And also these Calvinists who affirm that humans, at least occasionally, possess libertarian freedom. Like I say, at least sometimes regarding some things, some of the time, I guess. But I love to show people how they can be like Greg Koukl. Just a fantastic mind, a great apologist from Stand to Reason Ministries. And you can be like Greg Koukl and affirm both what I refer to as limited libertarian freedom, and you can also say that 5-point TULIP Calvinism is true. I think TULIP is false. I reject 5-point Calvinism. And interestingly, I used to be a staunch defender of the 5 points. I used to be a Calvinist. But I freely chose my mind, or else God determined me to stop being a Calvinist, one of the two. So why would he do a thing like that? But even though I reject TULIP, I think it's vital for apologetic purposes and for the sake of truth that all Christians reject exhaustive divine determinism and affirm that humans at least occasionally are free, in that libertarian sense. But this affirmation provides Calvinists the logical consistency to affirm several apologetics-based arguments. One, for example, is probably my favorite. I'm a little biased maybe, but it's called the free thinking argument. And you can even have one called the free thinking argument against naturalism. It deductively demonstrates that humans are a body-soul construct, right? So we're proving that the soul exists and that we've got the libertarian ability to freely think, which is essential if one wants to gain rationally inferred and affirmed knowledge claims. And then it logically and deductively demonstrates that the atheistic view of naturalism is false. And it goes on, the free thinking argument does, to show that the biblical view of God is the best explanation of reality. So the Calvinist who affirms exhaustive divine determinism, is committed to reject this powerful argument because of their assumption that that their interpretation of Scripture is correct, that we never have free will or libertarian free will. So bottom line, the Calvinist who affirms limited libertarian freedom, and by that I just mean libertarian freedom limited to things outside of salvation issues, right? Like Greg Koukl does. He might continue to affirm tulip because he's convinced that, for some reason, that although exhaustive divine determinism is false, that divine causal determinism applies to salvation. So I contend that Molinism allows a Calvinist off this exhaustive deterministic hook, if you will.
Right.
In fact, I think Molinism provides something that is, I'll say this, I think Molinism provides something that's functionally equivalent with tulip. Don't get me wrong here. It just also allows for human libertarian freedom and responsibility. But I think the wording of tulip is wrong philosophically, makes errors in the wording. But I think Molinism will give you something functionally equivalent without all the baggage and the bad stuff that comes along with the way tulips are worded. So let me just say that Molinism affirms exhaustive divine predestination of all things while rejecting exhaustive divine determinism of all things. Those are two different things. So predestination does not equal causal determinism. But I guess to answer your question, guys like Greg Koukl, they see the importance philosophically and biblically of freedom of the will in a libertarian sense. But they also think that the Bible teaches that that salvation is completely exhaustive, that exhaustive divine.
Determined. Right.
Exactly. Right.
Okay. So let's kind of talk through that a little bit more, because I think that this gets kind of to the root of some of the talking past each other, the accusation of misrepresentation that we often see in these kinds of discussions, because I may be confronting a Chris Date type of Calvinist who does affirm EDD, but they are the Greg Koukl kind of Calvinist that says, oh no, I believe in libertarian freedom. I'm fine with that. Some of our choices are libertarianly free, just not the choice to accept or reject the gospel appeal.
Right.
That's not free. That's not really yours. And so the reason I point that out is because when you're confronting these things, there's the philosophical level and there's the theological level, both of which are valid and important. I used to dismiss the philosophical a little bit, probably too much, because I was very into the theological aspects. But I recognize, I think, as C.S. Lewis says, that good philosophy has to exist, if for no other reason, to answer bad philosophy. And I honestly just think exhaustive divine determinism is really, really bad philosophy. And for reasons that we've described elsewhere. That doesn't mean I don't love the people who hold to it. You can love the people, but reject what they believe.
That's right.
Obviously. And so we love and respect our friends, but at the same time, I just really find exhaustive divine determinism to be a very bad philosophy, and bad theology wise.
I agree
as well. I don't think theologically it can be supported. And so in your efforts, it seems to me, it's almost like when you're talking with an atheist, and I'm not trying to equate Calvinists with atheists by any stretch of imagination, but it's almost like when you talk to an atheist, your first step is to get them to agnosticism. You try to move them over and say, you're not really an atheist, you're an agnostic, and here's why. And then from agnosticism, you can take them into the next stage. In the same way, if you're talking to somebody who disagrees with you philosophically on this topic, you can take them from hard EDD affirming 5-point Calvinist, superlapsarian type of Calvinist, and you can go, maybe you're a mere Molinist and you don't know it, and you can bring them here, because if you can get them here affirming at least the rationality of LFW, libertarian free will, then from there we can say, okay, now that you can see that it's not irrational to affirm libertarian free will, let's talk about whether or not the choice to reject or accept Christ is a libertarianly free choice or not.
That's right. And I'll, a couple people have accused me of, since I'm arguing for mere Molinism so much, it's like, you're just trying to get us all the way over there, And I'm like, look, of course I am, because I think it's true.
I'm probably trying harder than you are. Let's be honest with it. That's fine.
Look, I mean, really, this all started when I developed the free thinking argument against naturalism. This was back in 2012. I was a master's student at Biola, and I developed the free thinking argument against naturalism because it's against atheistic naturalism. I wanted to go after that view that was permeating culture. And I was a youth pastor at the time. And so I saw so many of my high school and college students that were being infected with this view. So I wanted to destroy naturalism, I think and I like to use that word because I think it's biblical. Paul uses it in 2 Corinthians 10:5. We're going to destroy every argument raised against the knowledge of God. And so I wanted to go after naturalism. But what blew my mind was I started giving these talks. I'd go give these presentations at apologetics conferences. And so I'm trying to equip the church to show people how to destroy this naturalistic worldview. And then so many in the church would stand up and push back, because one of the deductive conclusions is, therefore, humans possess libertarian freedom. Now, this is just simply regarding rationality and knowledge based on the use of reason, things like that. It had nothing to do with salvation. But so many Christians were attacking me harder than atheists and naturalists were. And so as I was doing my doctoral work, I actually switched from philosophy to theology, because I realized that, man, if I want to spend time destroying naturalism, I first have to solve this problem. So when people accuse me of trying to just get everybody over to the Molinist camp or to leave Tulip, I'm like, look, I think Tulip's false, so I don't want to lie and say I think you should move. But when I give mere Molinism, it's almost like I'm providing Calvinists a way so that they can have logical access to the free thinking argument as well.
Right.
So I still want to see Calvinists go out there and be good apologists and evangelists and lead people to Christ. I can share the gospel side by side with the Calvinists, even though we disagree on Calvinism. But I want them to have all the tools in their toolbox, or all the weapons on their belt as possible. The free thinking argument is powerful. I've seen it bring, for example, one of the atheist professors at the local university, evolutionary biologist of all people, is now a Christian. And she told me that what really got her attention was the free thinking argument. That's kind of what sealed the deal for her.
Well, I heard Braxton Hunter, who is a Molinist as well, we've had on the program before, his debate with Matt Delahunty, a well-known atheist. I
helped him prepare for that a little bit, actually.
Yeah, I was going to actually mention that he used the free will, the free thinking argument, if you will, in that debate. And I think it was one of the first times I ever heard it laid out that way, the way Braxton did. And so it is a strong argument. And what you're trying to say is that someone who affirms what Braxton does and what you do with mere Molinism can keep their Calvinism, but still use this as a tool in their tool belt in apologetics, like Greg Koukl.
Like Greg Koukl. Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I just want to give a shout out to Braxton, because, as we were talking, I talked to him just a little bit beforehand and sent him some things of mine to read. But I was so impressed with how he laid out a free thinking argument of sorts. He laid it out differently than I do. And I was like, dude, I'm sharing that in my dissertation as well. and so I give Braxton a shout out in my dissertation, because awesome. He's just a great thinker.
He is. Braxton is. He's younger than me, but I consider him a mentor in a lot of the philosophical world, especially. I'm always talking with him on Marco Polo and asking him different questions, and he's giving me all kinds of good insights. And so we love Braxton Hunter there at Trinity, and he does a great job.
And Jonathan.
Of course, Pritchett. That just goes
yeah.
without saying, though. You don't have to say anything about Pritchett. Everybody just knows already. Everybody, you don't want to give him a big head. You gotta be careful.
Well, his biceps are getting big enough. We don't need his head to
what's the deal with that? He's like a rock star now.
He is now, man. And what's funny is he told me that I was inspiration for him to get physically fit. Well, now he's way beyond where I am. Now I'm looking at him like, man, I'd like to be
Well,
like
like
you.
you're like a former martial arts guy, aren't you? I mean,
Yeah, former. Yeah.
and a former Calvinist too.
That's
We
right.
forgot to mention that at the beginning. But of
Yeah.
course, if you've left Calvinism, then you couldn't have ever really been a Calvinist, according to
James
Calvinists.
White. That's what James White has said.
Apparently, you can't ever have actually been a Calvinist.
That's right.
But okay, let's get back into that part of it then.
Okay.
So if as a so let's talk about EDD for a sec. Exhaustive divine determinism. The most popular Calvinist that I can think of who most assuredly affirms exhaustive divine determinism is probably John Piper. Would you agree with that?
I do think that he would hold that view. I think Guillaume Bignon holds that view. I've talked to him, actually. He's affirmed that to me. Matthew J. Hart, in his recent essay, has affirmed that view. And in that essay, he cites Paul Helm as holding that view. And
Right.
so, yeah, I think it's a very common view in the Calvinist camp.
And so a lot of my program have been addressing the Piper form of exhaustive divine determinism, often quoting him and John Piper, and John Calvin himself in some of those statements that do seem to affirm EDD. And so some people get a little bit upset and say, hey, you're not representing Calvinism very well, all these kinds of things. And I understand where they're coming from. I hear their angst in that because they may not be a John Piper type of Calvinist, but you've got to acknowledge, I think, that John Piper is probably the most influential Calvinist living today.
I think
and
so.
A huge swath of young people are following his leadership and believing his form of Calvinism. And therefore, for us to confront that is not to avoid the issue. It's really trying to address what we see as one of the major points of contention within this debate. But
that's why I used to be a Calvinist, is because of Piper. I mean, his book, I think it was called Don't Waste Your Life. And in that book, he's got a chapter called, I think it's called To Risk is Right or something like that. And I always give Piper props because I read that book. I was a Calvinist at the time, just read that chapter about risk. And I saw this beautiful woman named Tia. And I was like, she's way out of my league, but I'm going to take a risk because to risk is right. And I asked her out and eventually she became my wife. So if it wasn't for John Piper, I wouldn't be married to my wife, Tia Stratton, today. So, so thank you, Piper. But you got that part right, but your Calvinism is wrong.
Well, Piper would tell you it has nothing to do with him. It was all a part of the sovereign decree. So,
yeah, and I'll just say, well, it depends what you mean by decree, because I affirm the decree too, but I think we mean different things by it.
Right. Yes, and that becomes part of the problem. That's one of the reasons I've stopped using the term decree, because of the overwhelming use of it. But I don't fault people who want to claim and still try to, almost like the word sovereignty. Sometimes I find myself avoiding the word sovereignty because I know the misuse of it. But you hate to lose good words. And I think you're probably right to try to redeem the word, to say, hey, decree does not necessarily mean exhaustive divine determinism.
And neither does predestination. I think a lot of, I'll talk to Calvinists all the time and I'll say, well, I believe this. And they'll say, well, you were predestined to believe that, or you're predestined to do whatever you do. And I'm like, yeah, I agree. I just don't think that predestination means that I was determined to do it. I think God can predestine free creatures to do certain things that are really up to me and that I could have done otherwise. So, I like to push back a little bit and take words back. Even the word reformed, I get frustrated with, well, I'm reformed. I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? Yeah. So am I, like, well, no, you're not, in fact, I got my PhD from, it's a secular university, but with a reformed theology department, and they're staunch reformed. And so I had to demonstrate how what I was arguing for, even I argued against Tulip, and to show how that was compatible with at least their definitions of what it meant to be a reformed theologian. So, I like to say, not so fast. You don't have exclusive rights to certain words. I get to use them too.
Well,
and here's why.
I even quote from Philip Melanchthon in my view of Romans 9, because he interprets Romans 9 more like I do than the way Calvinists do. Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, Philip Melanchthon is, of course, the Greek scholar there in Wittenberg during the time of Luther, as you well know.
Oh, yeah.
And even Luther called him the greater of the two scholars.
Right. He
and
was
so,
the systematic theologian of the Reformation.
right. And
Right.
so, and he did not affirm much of what we would think of as soteriological Calvinism today.
Well, he plays a vital role in my dissertation. Melanchthon does.
Wow. Oh, cool. That's good.
Yeah. He affirms libertarian. I mean, I don't think he would. I think he would probably affirm that salvation issues are determined, but he sure argues for what's compatible with mere Molinism, that humans at least sometimes have libertarian freedom. They didn't use that term back then, libertarian freedom,
right?
But the way he describes it is totally consistent with the definition of libertarian freedom as I've defined it. So.
Well, and I always point people to Balthasar Hubmaier too, because Balthasar Hubmaier was long before even Luther came on the scene. He was fighting against the ills of the Catholic Church and the false beliefs of the Catholic Church, and was actually way ahead of his time in that he believed in religious freedom, that we shouldn't condemn heretics, that we should treat them with patience and prayer, not with sword and fire. Wow. Why? Because that's what Jesus would do. He is patient with us.
Amen.
And he long suffering with us, therefore we should be long suffering with the heretic.
Amen.
And so, and he held to a universal view of the atonement and a provision for all people and God's desire for all people to be saved. But he wasn't well known. Why? Because he was burned at the stake, and his wife was thrown into a river under the rule of Zwingli with a millstone tied around her neck because they taught in believers' baptism.
Wow.
And so you wonder why, when you look throughout history, why some of the people who hold to our view aren't very well known. Well, usually because they were burned, and all their works were burned with them. And so it's hard to find historically a provisionist theology throughout history, because they were usually the ones getting burned. And so they
couldn't just go on YouTube and express their views to everybody.
Yeah, it was harder to get it out then. And so if you had the ability to kill and burn up people's works, which usually would only be like going into their study and finding one notebook, one paper, because it was pretty easy to burn up their stuff because it wasn't spread like it is so widely today.
That's interesting.
But let's get back to kind of the Molinist who holds to tulip. Okay.
Yeah.
So somebody who's a mere Molinist, which maybe let's use Greg Kokel because he's our friend. We love Greg. We think he does a great job. We have a high amount of respect for him.
Yeah.
We disagree with him on his soteriological adherence to tulip. But he would, in my understanding, he would affirm libertarian free will as you've described it. He would affirm mere Molinism as you've described it. Why wouldn't he drop tulip, and why should he drop tulip? Maybe let's pretend Greg watches this and you get an opportunity to explain to him why he should drop tulip as a mere Molinist.
Well, I think he should drop tulip for the same reason everybody else should drop tulip, because it ultimately violates what we know about God based on biblical data. And I have a few different versions of what I refer to as the Omni argument. A couple of these, 2 or 3 of them are in my dissertation. But here's one that specifically goes after tulip, and namely the eye of tulip, the irresistible grace. So let me get this so I can see. Okay. So it's a 10-step syllogism. So it's kind of long, but bear with me here. All right. Premise 1, if irresistible grace is true, then for any person X, if God desires to, has the power to, and knows how to cause X to go to heaven and not suffer eternally in hell, then X will go to heaven and not suffer eternally in hell. Okay, premise 2. If God is omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and omniscient, then for any person X, God desires to, has the power to, and knows how to cause X to go to heaven and not suffer eternally in hell. 3, there is at least one person who will not go to heaven and will suffer eternally in hell. 4, conclusion. Therefore, one cannot affirm both one, that irresistible grace is true, and two, that God is omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and omniscient, aka a maximally great being. Step 5, but God is a maximally great being. 6, therefore, irresistible grace is false, right? The I is false, so tulip goes down the drain right there. 7, therefore, divine determinism is false, at least exhaustively. God does not causally determine all things. 8, God is completely sovereign and does predestine all things. Romans 8, 29 through 30, Ephesians 1, 5 and 11, just to get us started. God does predestine all things. 9, therefore, predestination and determinism are not to be conflated. That's a logical error. 10, the best explanation of the data is a soteriological view of Molinism. So based on the Omni argument, one can rationally conclude that God is a maximally great being, just as the Bible implies. And Molinism allows for, like I said earlier, an exhaustive predestination of all things all the time. That even includes election and God's complete sovereignty over all creation, which is arguably the primary goal of what the Eye of Tulip wants to affirm in the first place. But this is all while allowing, in a logically broad sense, God's love and grace to be resistible and for it to truly be possible for all people to be saved. And this conclusion demonstrates how God is a maximally great being who possesses each of his vital omni attributes. And therefore, this is the important part, therefore, God can and should be trusted. So, yeah, that's my omni argument.
Now, that's interesting. And I'm glad to hear it from another perspective, because usually, obviously, the way that I confront Tulip is just going to the passages where they use to support Tulip. For example, when a Calvinist goes to 1 Corinthians 2:14, for example, to say that this demonstrates that people can't understand the Bible and believe it, and therefore they can't receive Jesus unless there's some irresistible supernatural work of regeneration. Then I go to 1 Corinthians 2 and I explain to them that Paul is contrasting the wisdom of the wise of the world versus the revelation of God, and those who rely upon the wisdom of the world instead of the revelation of God will declare the cross foolish. It's not based upon some innate condition that they're born with that they have no control over. It's because they're resting on the wisdom of the world versus listening to the revelation of God. And I'll explain that theologically and exegetically, and that's how I confront it. But what you're doing, it seems, is you're coming from the philosophical side of things to say, here's philosophically why you should also reject it. And so it's kind of a two-pronged. You're not saying we shouldn't do the exegetical. The exegetical is fine.
That's exactly right.
But you're saying it's both and that we.
That's right. I call it a 1-2 punch, and I have many scriptures that I go to as well to show how this doesn't fit, how their view doesn't fit with scripture. But man, I mean, you can talk about all these verses and how God doesn't desire anybody to perish and desires all people to be saved. Oh, well, that's all kinds of people. It doesn't mean all people. It's all different types of people. I'm like, oh, okay. Then finally, I'm like, all right, look, there's some people that just seem determined to not follow the best interpretation of Scripture. I'll say, all right, fine. If the Bible's true, it will always be logical. Here's a logical argument demonstrating that your interpretation of Scripture is false. So I don't care how good your Greek or Hebrew is. If your Greek or Hebrew leads you to incoherent thoughts and ideas and beliefs, then we know that your view is false. Because so logic in this sense, I say, is it's like the nuke, right? It's important to know your Greek and Hebrew. You're probably much better at it than I am, but lots of people are. But if logic shows that a certain interpretation of somebody who knows Greek and is reading the Greek, and this person, based on his reading of Greek, is reaching incoherent nonsense, then we know that his interpretation is necessarily false.
Yeah.
I use scripture and logic.
And I've played in the past quotes from John MacArthur and J.I. Packer. These are guys, older generation guys, that often do this, where they'll say, well, yeah, you're making a free choice. And they'll even use free in a libertarian sense.
Really?
Yeah, you're making a free choice, but it was also determined exhaustively by God before the foundation of the world.
Yeah.
And you just have to accept those two.
And that's why I say, no, it was predestined. It wasn't determined. And then you make them define what they mean.
Right.
So,
And that may be, and we may be
Yeah.
using, you and I probably coming from different vantage points. I use predestined probably different than you do. Usually when I talk about predestination, the two times it's used, again, theologically for me, is in Romans 8 and Ephesians 1, soteriologically. And both times it's talking about believers being predestined to be conformed to the image of Christ, or predestined to be made holy and blameless. And so it's about the destination that God has determined beforehand for those who are in Christ. It's not even a philosophical
for an individual
esoteric view.
Right.
It's not really a view of exhaustive providence,
right.
Overall things in my perspective.
And I think you're probably right with that interpretation. I would just say that if Molinism is true, it gives you divine predestination of all things. So God created a world in which he knew how and how everybody would freely choose. And so the word freely doesn't magically disappear once God creates that world.
Right.
And so you can say, even though you were free to do it and you could have done otherwise, well, God, knowing how you would freely choose, you can say that, well, since he knew that before he created, and he created anyway, that's a form of predestination. But causal determinism is still false, because you actually, on this Molinistic view, you're free to do it, and you actually, I believe, could have done otherwise. So, but yeah, I think you're probably right. There's different ways that predestination can be used even in Scripture. And so I think you're right on that.
One of the things that you talked about in your conversation with Eli, and you were responding to James White, who was on Eli's program, and this is something he teases me about pretty regularly, James White has, about me talking about, well, I guess I've been predetermined to reject determinism, if what you say is true. And then he just mocks it. He's, oh, you're so silly, kind of gaslights me a little bit. And then I will read from William Lane Craig, who I know is smart. So in other words, I know this is not a dumb argument that's just not from somebody who's just not philosophically trained like me. I know it's from somebody who knows what they're talking about. And then I heard you talking to Eli, and Eli seemed to be in agreement with you that it's not right for James White or anybody else to dismiss an argument as being just not well thought out or small or stupid, because so talk to us about that. I think the way William Lane Craig describes it is a kind of a dizzying feeling of this exhaustive divine determinism, because you're ultimately determined as to whether you accept or reject determinism, and you're ultimately determined as to whether you accept provisionism. And so how can you rationally affirm any truth statement and it be rational if EDD is true? Why don't you talk about that a little bit? Help us understand.
Yeah. So Eli, when he interviewed James White, Eli told me that he had I brought it up here earlier, the free thinking argument in mind. And so I've got the free thinking argument against naturalistic determinism, and I've got the free thinking argument against exhaustive divine determinism. And so Eli, without going through the premises, challenged James White with the free thinking argument against exhaustive divine determinism. And he just dodged that question. I mean, he wound up saying that it was a violation of the incarnation or something like that. And I was like, that's got nothing to do with Christmas. And he said it was not well thought out. I'm like, well, I've got a master's thesis and a PhD dissertation that says otherwise. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's definitely thought out. And if you want to show why it's wrong, you need to deal with my argument. You need to deal with the premises. You need to show why my argument is either invalid or not sound in some form or fashion. You can't just dismiss it as not well thought out.
Well, and the way that he dismissed it when I said it, and I said it in a much more simple layman kind of way, is, well, I guess I'm determined to reject determinism. Something like that is the way I would say it. And he would say, well, Leighton flattens this out. It's much more diamond shaped. It's multi-orbed, which to me, it says nothing. You're not answering anything by saying that. All you're saying is it's mysterious, and I don't know how to describe it, but it's not as flat as you want it to be, Leighton. It's diamond shaped. But then I go, okay, what does that mean?
Right. Doesn't mean anything. I mean, we're my argument is based on the laws of logic. And so you're gonna have to show me, why one of these premises is false and how the conclusion doesn't follow logically from these premises. And and I like to give thought experiments too. And I did this on Eli's show, I think, and I even used James White as the main character. And I said, suppose a mad scientist somehow secretly gains access to Dr. White's brain. And so now the mad scientist can causally determine, and he causally determines everything that Dr. White thinks of and about. He causally determines how Dr. White thinks, or what he thinks of and about, and exactly how he thinks of and about it. Everything about James White's thinking is causally determined by the mad scientist. In fact, even the next words that will come out of James White's mouth is causally determined by the mad scientist. And I say, okay, stop. I have a question for James White. Question: how can you, not the mad scientist, rationally affirm any of your beliefs, including your belief that Calvinism is true? Rationally affirm it. Not the mad scientist, James White. Go. Impossible. You can't do it. James White then cannot rationally affirm that Calvinism is true unless he wants to. He can assume it. But wait, that assumption's not even up to him. The mad scientist caused that assumption. So yeah, that's what Dr. Craig refers to as this vertigo that sets in for everything that you think. Even your thought that determinism is true, it's not up to you. It was causally determined by someone or something else. So it's a major problem. In fact, I argue that on this exhaustive divine deterministic view, the self vanishes, the I disappears. In fact, I've got an article on my website at freethinkingministries.com called The Vanishing I, and I get into some of these problems.
I'm interested in, Eli didn't get into it in the program, but I'm interested in how Chris Date or Eli would reply to that as ones who affirm EDD, and to look, he never gave an answer on the program, and he wasn't trying to. I'm not saying that he couldn't, but do you know of any of the Calvinists who actually?
I've brought it to so many Calvinists and nobody answers it. So if there's a way to answer it, I'm still waiting.
Now, Greg Kokel doesn't have to answer it because he's adopted mere Molinism.
That's right. He can answer it just fine.
Right. But the guys who still adhere to, well, maybe Ben Yong would take you up on that offer. He seems to be.
I'd love to hear it. I mean, I deal with his book is one of my main. Well, I really go after some of the things he says in his book in chapter 5 of my dissertation. And I've talked with him in person on a couple occasions as well. Great guy. Love his accent.
I brilliant. I extend an invitation for both of y'all to come on the program and let y'all hash it out. I would love to hear
that'd be cool.
How those things could be rationally affirmed, how you can rationally affirm under the exhaustive divine determinism.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, if there's a way around that problem, I'd love to hear it. But yeah, I've written a lot about that on my website too, if people want to go there to see that problem.
Now, one of the things that James White is kind of known for is he'll grab one statement and use that as his reason for dismissing everything that a person says. He did this with the choice meats comment taken out of its context about me. Right. And now every time anything brought up about me comes up, he'll just go, oh, choice meats. And then I don't have to deal with his argument anymore. And he does that with William Lane Craig now too, with the whole, oh, well, I would rather worship the card dealer. Yeah, I'm going to worship the card dealer.
That's so not charitable, right? I mean, at least in my apologetics classes and philosophy classes, we were taught you always be charitable. You don't attack a straw man. In fact, you try to make their argument better. Attack a steel man, not a straw man. If you can improve on their argument, do it, and then attack that. And I'm just, in fact, I've written an article on my website too. I think it's called Playing the Cards God's Been Dealt is what it's called. And I really go after that, how James White uncharitably goes after Dr. Craig based on that statement.
Yeah, I went to Israel with Dr. Craig and several others. Mike Lacona is a mutual friend of ours. He and his wife, and they actually
Hi,
posts on
Mike and
Facebook.
Debbie.
Debbie's watching. I'm sure we love the Lyconas. And one of the things Dr. Craig said in our meal, I mentioned to him what James White always says. What was funny to me is this was only a year or so ago, and he had never heard it. He doesn't. I guess he doesn't pay attention to this stuff online because it's been around for a long time.
Yeah.
But I mentioned to him that Dr. White critiques his argument, saying, well, I would rather worship the card dealer,
Right.
who's dealing the cards, and of course Dr. Craig kind of laughed and said, "Oh, that's a good one." And then he went on, just kind of laughed it off and
not
went on.
impressed.
I said, well,
right.
Yeah. And then I said, well, would you ever consider responded to him? And he has gone, really? What he knows, he knows that's not what we mean by that illustration, doesn't he? He's almost like going, surely he knows, surely that was a joke, right? It was just a joke.
Well, the problem
so I left it alone from there.
Even if James White should know better, but even if he doesn't, one way or the other, all of his followers are persuaded. I mean, I can't tell you. In fact, in my article, I think I shared a meme that I saw saying who's issuing the cards to God or something like that. We're in with Dr. Craig's face on it. And so I know that many of the people that listen to Dr. White's show do take that completely out of context. And so that's why I wrote my article on the website.
Okay. And so if somebody is not going to take the time to go read the article, can you in brief just give, kind of like you did with Eli, I think you did a good job just describing what Dr. White was what Dr. Craig was trying to describe, that if God makes the choice to create libertarian free creatures, then in other words, he's dealing that card. I mean, he's the one who's deciding to step within that realm. Talk about that, just, that internet Calvinist that's yelling at somebody who's a Molinist saying, oh, well, I would rather worship the card dealer. How would you explain that to him briefly, if it's possible?
Here's the question. Does God have the ability? Does an omnipotent God have the ability to create a card dealer? All right. By that I mean, does an omnipotent God possess the ability and the power to create a being, a creature, who could choose between a range of possible alternatives, each compatible with that creature's image of God nature? Does an omnipotent God have that ability? Now, if that's the case, even if God never does create this free creature, then an omniscient God would know how this free creature would freely choose if he created him. In fact, our good friend Eric Hernandez and I have talked about this in the past.
Yeah.
And
another good Molinist friend who actually works with me there at Texas Baptist.
That's right. Yeah. What's up, Eric? He's just brilliant, by the way. One of the smartest guys I've ever met.
That's why I hired him.
Yeah. But yeah, God doesn't even actually need to create free creatures or card dealers. The question is, does God have the ability to create a free creature or a card dealer? Now, if he does, then God would know, an omniscient God would know how this free creature would freely choose if he creates him. So that's what Dr. Craig means by card dealer here.
Right.
Now, God doesn't have to create a card dealer. He doesn't have to.
He's in control of that. He didn't have to create free creatures.
But if it's important for God for some reason, and I can think of several, at least 3, maybe 5 off the top of my head, but
all the free will arguments that you've heard from Ravi Zacharias and William Craig, all of those fit within that reason. Yes. Right.
So if it's important for God to create free creatures in a libertarian sense, then God makes a choice to, if you want to use these words, to be limited by their free choices. And he knows how they're going to choose, and he chooses to create them anyways. But he's not limited by them, because they don't actually exist when God knows he has the power to create them and knows how they would freely choose if he creates them. They're not putting any limitations on him. God makes a decision based on his own pleasure, right? Yep. And how he sees fit and what's important to him. And I think what's important to him is to create free creatures. And we can show that biblically, theologically, philosophically, and many other
And
several
a lot of
different ways,
this,
yeah.
a lot of this debate gets down to the understanding of knowledge, especially divine knowledge, which is beyond our full comprehension. Obviously, we barely can understand how we know things, much less how an infinite being knows things. And so, so when we're asked the question, how does God know the future free? When I say word free, I always mean libertarian freedom. So how does God know the future free choices of creatures? We say we don't know how he knows those things. We just believe that he does. And just like we would say, I don't know how God has all power. I don't know how he creates something from nothing.
Right.
I just
how do you
believe
create the universe?
Yeah, that's just a part of his essence. He just is. And so we all appeal to mystery with regard to the omnis of God, his infinite knowledge, his infinite power. We all just appeal to mystery. The Calvinist doesn't appeal to mystery on that question. He says the reason that we know, that God knows the future free choices of creatures is that he has causally determined those choices. And that's what we're saying.
Then the question is, but can God create a free creature? So even if they want to say, and this is what I think Eric has pointed out before, fine, let's just assume for the sake of argument that everything is causally determined in the world that we exist in. Could God have, God's got to have libertarian freedom, unless one wants to say that we exist necessarily. And that's going to run into big problems.
Yep.
So theological problems the Calvinist doesn't want to do. So God can either create or not decreate, create the universe or just continue existing alone in a static state of perfect aseity, right? Or he can create the universe. And I think he could probably create many. I mean, the term omnipotent implies many options, each compatible with God's nature. But the very least you need is the ability to create or not to create. Obviously, since we're having this conversation, we know that God chose to create. But he could have done otherwise. So if God has the ability to choose between a range of options, each compatible with his nature, it stands to reason that God could create beings in his image who also do have the ability to choose between a range of alternative options, each compatible with our image of God nature. Right. Now, I've heard some Calvinists say, well, that violates the creature or the creator-creature distinction. No, It doesn't.
Well, in my first interaction with James White on Twitter back in the day, that I didn't put it near as in a concinct way as you just did, and in a professional way as you did. I made a different way of making the same argument you just made. I really talked about him personally. I said, could God have not created you, James White? Did he have to create you? And that's the way I put the argument. And I was pointing to the same argument you're making here. And his rebuttal was to say, well, this goes back to that age-old question: can God create a rock so big that he can't move it?
No, it doesn't.
And my rebuttal, and you can tell me if this is a philosophically sound rebuttal or not, but my rebuttal was, that's not the debate at all.
That's right.
The debate is whether God could create a rock that he chooses not to move or not. In other words, can he create a creature that he chooses not to determine or not?
Yeah, there's a big difference between saying, can God create a married bachelor? Can God create, or can God draw a triangle of four corners? No, God can't do those things. But okay, there's communicable attributes, right? That creatures have with their creator. God has perfect knowledge. Creatures have some knowledge. God is love. He's perfect love. Humans can experience love, probably not the way he loves us, right? But we can experience love. He's the perfect standard of love. We're not, but we can love. God has power. Humans have some power. God can create, or God can choose between a range of options, each compatible with his nature. Humans can choose between a range of options, each compatible with our image of God nature. There's no logical contradiction on the face of it, and I contend even implied in it, unless somebody can show me exactly what the problem is. Then it's just so ad hoc to reject it and say, no, that doesn't go along with my Calvinistic determinism view. So creator creature violation.
Right,
no, It doesn't work that way. So yeah, I don't know if I kind of got off topic there.
No, you're. I mean, and it really comes down to, where are you going to appeal to mystery? on all of these things.
Right.
And I think that's really what it comes down to.
Well, I like to say, and you're right. I like to say, I'm not saying that we never punt to mystery. But the difference is like, okay, so that Omni argument I brought up, I've never seen a rebuttal to that argument that passes. But I will see some Calvinists say, well, I'll just punt to mystery. I don't know how to make sense of it, but I'll do that. I'm like, well, look, I've got a logical argument here. You can't just punt to mystery. Now, when they say, yeah, well, how does God know? And I'm like, well, I don't know. I mean, I can ground those truth makers ultimately in his nature, that God has the power to create a free creature. And since he's omniscient, he knows how that free creature would freely choose if he creates them. And even if he never does create them, that's ultimately grounded in God's nature.
Right.
Now, but then the next question, but how does God know that truth maker? Beats the heck out of me. I also don't know how God created the universe from nothing, but I'm not going to say, well, since I don't know how God has the power to create the universe from nothing, I'm not going to reject it. And again, the Calvinist is being ad hoc and inconsistent, unless he wants to say, well, God can't create the universe from nothing either. But it's really it's on that same level.
Well, and we've got to appeal to mystery where the Bible affords mystery. And I don't think the Bible tells us how God creates something from nothing, just like it doesn't tell us how he knows the future free choices of Judas to betray him, or the future free choices of Peter to deny him 3 times before the rooster crows. He doesn't tell us how he gained that knowledge. That's not the word that we would want to use, even, because how does God gain anything or learn something? Well, again, that's where the appeal to mystery is. But when you step into scripture and you put in something and say, well, God knows it because he's the one who determined it. He's the one who causally wrote it and brought it to pass. Then you've gone beyond the scriptures into a philosophical.
That's philosophy.
Yeah, that's pure philosophy, because the Bible never says that God has determined pride and lust. Matter of fact, 1 John 2:16 says these things are not from the Father, but from the world. And so there's denials of scripture. He doesn't even tempt men to evil in James. So you can't step over scripture into philosophy and say, well, if God knows all things, then he must ultimately be the determiner of it. And this is where I always push back and say, yeah, there is a problem of omniscience. Omniscience has its problem. Boethius tried to answer it back in the 6th century. C.S. Lewis holds to the eternal view of God, which I promote in my book. Molinism gives a sufficient answer to the problem of omniscience. There is a problem of omniscience, but the problem of omniscience is not the same problem as EDD, what I would call omni-determinism. Okay, so omni-determinism and omniscience both have problems. They are different problems.
Yeah.
And what some Calvinists do is they say, oh, they're the same problem. So you guys who affirm omniscience over here, you have the same problem as we do who affirm omni-determinism. And so you too, instead of answering the problem, they just use the you too argument. And so you have the same problem because you affirm omniscience. And this is why they'll say, oh, the only rational way to go, James White does this to me all the time, the only rational place for you to land is open theism, is that you have to deny omniscience. Because if you continue to affirm omniscience, you have to affirm omni-determinism, because there's no way around that. What do you say to that?
Well, first thing I would want to say is James White has demonstrated on his with his interview with Eli Ayala that, well, he doesn't have access to saying that he has rationally concluded anything. Because the determinist somebody who affirms exhaustive determinism, whether it be natural or divine, is going to run into epistemology problems or rationality problems. So I have an argument first, and I'll say, so James White really appeals to the grounding objection. How does God know, in order to dismiss these things? And so I'm going to show you here that it's actually James White and the Calvinists like him who are going to run into, they're going to become open theists themselves. They are the ones who are promoting open theism. Here's a deductive conclusion, or a deductive argument. Premise 1, if the grounding objection passes, then God does not possess knowledge of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, CCFs, logically prior to his creative decree, and Molinism is false. 2, if God does not possess knowledge of CCFs logically prior to his creative decree, then either exhaustive divine determinism is true or open theism is true. 3, if exhaustive divine determinism is true, then one is not free to engage in the process of rationality to infer and affirm the best explanation. That is, rationally inferred knowledge is impossible. 4, therefore, if one affirms that one has rationally inferred that exhaustive divine determinism is the best explanation, probably true, and they believe that the grounding objection passes, then exhaustive divine determinism is false. Conclusion. Therefore, if one thinks the grounding objection passes and shows that Molinism is false, then open theism is the only live option left to rationally affirm, right? Left to rationally affirm. So that's the argument. And this syllogism it should give Calvinists, Compatibilists, or any divine determinist pause before they offer the grounding objection against Molinism. And this is because these folks, although they don't like Molinism, they seem to have a complete revulsion against open theism. Thus, if they think that they have rationally concluded that Calvinism is true because of the grounding objection or via any other argument, then they have inadvertently defeated their own Calvinistic determinism, leaving only open theism on the table. Right. So I'll just close with this. Since the process of rationality leading to inferential knowledge is illusory on any exhaustive deterministic view, if all thoughts and beliefs are causally determined, a simple equation shows what logically follows if an advocate of the grounding objection also holds to divine determinism exhaustively, since it cannot rationally be affirmed. So here's your equation. Theism plus the grounding objection plus rationality equals open theism. Now, I know James White is opposed to open theism, so he's got to dismiss one of those other things that equals open theism. So you got theism plus the grounding objection plus rationality equals open theism. Well, he can't get rid of theism because Calvinists believe in God. He can't get rid of rationality because he says that he's rationally concluded Calvinism's true and that Molinism is false and that you should be an open theist. Well, now he's only left with the grounding objection to get rid of. So my point is that Calvinists cannot use the grounding objection if they're also going to affirm rationality and the existence of God, if they want to, because they can't keep their Calvinism. They've got to become an open theist at that point. So I don't know if I answered your question, but it just sparked something, and I'm like, I got to share this.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably why. Tell me if I'm wrong here, because when you don't have it written out, I'm a visual learner, so I probably need to read what you're saying, and look at it even more in depth. And a lot of times I'll listen back to my interviews, and I'll do that, and it helps me a lot. So some of this may ding with me more later as I listen to it again. But it reminded me of something I read Dr. Craig say one time about how Calvinist and open theist are strange bedfellows, in that they both deny the ability of God to know the future libertarian free choices of creatures. In other words, open theists say God can't know something that doesn't exist yet, and since the choice doesn't exist yet, they can't know it. Well, that's exactly what the Calvinist is objecting to in the grounding objection. How can you know if a creature doesn't exist? How can you know his choices are what he's going to do? And so the same objection, they're both bringing the same philosophical modal objection to if God knows something, then he must be the determiner of it. And therefore the open theist says, well, he doesn't know it. And the Calvinist says, well, he determines it. Right. And so they're strange bedfellows in that they're bringing the same philosophical problem to bear. And what you just laid out seems to be the reason that either you side, if you're going to accept that problem, you're either going to have to side with Calvinism, EDD, exhaustive divine determinism, or you're going to have to side with open theism. God really doesn't know the future free choices of creatures.
But if EDD is true, you can't rationally come to what side you're going to be on. And so
open theism really is the more
only
rational answer if you accept that premise. If you accept the premise of Calvinism and open theism, then open theism is a better option than Calvinism.
I would say, well, I'd say if one thinks the grounding objection proves that Molinism is false, then you're only left with exhaustive divine determinism or open theism left to choose between those two options. But then if you're going to say but I think rationally Calvinism is a better view. Well, now you've actually just shown that to be self-defeating, leaving open theism as the only view.
Because
so I know that's kind of,
yeah,
let me,
it is interesting. And the way that I've pushed on this, Tim, and you tell me, I've pushed at it from the more theological side of things, maybe appealing to emotive reasonings to some degree. But I've said if it's a difference between God's ability and his character when it comes to open theism versus EDD, exhaustive divine determinism, because ultimately EDD brings into question God's character. Is God determining the rapist's choice to rape?
Right.
Whereas the open theist is really bringing into question God's ability to know future free choices.
That's right.
And I don't know about you, but if somebody says, "Hey, Leighton, you're weak. You can't bench press 100 pounds," you're bringing into question my ability. I'm not going to care about that so much. Or Leighton, you're blind. Or Leighton, you can't drive. Or if you question my abilities, I might get a little offended, but not really. But if you start questioning my character,
right,
Leighton, you are disingenuous. You don't really love your wife, whatever. I'm going to be very angry at that. So if I'm going to err, I would rather err on the side of questioning one's ability versus questioning one's character.
Amen to that.
Does that make sense? I mean, is that a sound argument with regard to if you're going to accept the grounding principle or the grounding objection against omniscience, the idea of omniscience? It seems to be better to side with the open theist than with the EDD Calvinist.
Yeah, I mean, that's a completely different argument than the one I just gave, but I also agree with you. I mean, if I'm left, if somebody were able to show me that Molinism is false, and that and so then my systematic,
like if an angel appeared to you and said,
that too.
Tim, I'm not going to tell you anything else, but I'm going to just tell you Molinism is not right.
That's right. That's right.
All that you knew.
Yeah. Then I'd be like, you must be a fallen angel. No, I don't know. But no, if it were demonstrated to me that Molinism was false, and I was left with choosing between, and that I couldn't be a free thinker, right? No, I don't mean an atheistic sense. I mean, I didn't have the libertarian freedom to think and get reason-based knowledge. Then, well, number one, then I would have to reject exhaustive divine determinism. Maybe I could affirm at that point Greg Koukle's Calvinism, but
Greg Koukle is relying upon Molinistic premise, isn't he?
Yeah, right.
So, and I know you, and I'm trying to keep you from having to say you would have to affirm open theism over Calvinism because you're going to get a host of letters for saying something like that. But I think maybe what you could say is you could take a lighter form of open theism, which is that God chooses not to not know those things so as to maintain. In other words, if his omniscience is what's keeping him from having the ability to make free choice, creatures with free choice ability, then he can always limit his power in order to maintain that. In other words, can God choose not to know something in the future, like Jesus not knowing the day or the hour? He's obviously God, but chooses not to know something.
Yeah, I think the only way God can do that is to do an incarnation, and that's really fleshed out, if you will.
I'm just trying to think of a form of open theism that doesn't deny God's power, because that form of open theism wouldn't deny his power, because it ultimately be saying God is choosing to withhold that ability or to pull back that ability in order to overcome that philosophical problem that I think we've created. But if you're going to maintain that philosophical problem is truly a problem, then that would be one way to get around it from an open theist perspective.
Yeah. No, I just want to get back to your original challenge. I think, what is the better view of God's character between an exhaustive divine deterministic Calvinistic approach or open theism? It's open theism. But I think both views are false, and that's why I'm a Molinist. Right. I don't think open theism can. I don't think it's an inference to the best explanation or interpretation of Scripture by any means. But I also don't. I gave a logical argument showing that the Calvinistic view of irresistible grace isn't a good interpretation of Scripture either. So at the end of the day, in fact, the last sentence I think of my dissertation says, therefore, Molinism is the inference to the best explanation of all the data. I'm not dogmatic and say Molinism must be true. I'm willing to change my mind on that. I just think it's the inference to the best explanation of all the data, the biblical data, philosophical data, metaphysical data, historical data. I mean, whatever you want to throw at it, I think Molinism is the best explanation.
Now, in preparation for our program, I sent you snapshots of my book where I talk about the eternal now view of God that was originated with Boethius, I think, back in the Consolation of Philosophy in the 6th century, popularized, I think, by C.S. Lewis, where he talks about how God's knowledge is not either past or future, but more like our present reality, the eternal now view that God knows all things, not because he deterministically controls them, but because he is in the eternal now, which is not really an answer. It's more of an appeal to mystery in and of itself. It's saying we don't know how God knows all things. This is just one way for us in our limited way to describe his knowledge as not being fixed as in the past or fixed as in future looking through a crystal ball, but in the sense of the present reality of now, of being present while free creatures make their choices. And my listening to Molinism and Molinism being described, it seems to be that the eternal now view is like the first step of that, of saying God's knowledge is beyond our full comprehension, which is ultimately what Molinism ends up appealing to the mystery of, is how does God know all things? Well, we appeal to the mystery of that on both of those views. And so they seem to be compatible. It just seems to me Molinism goes further than the eternal now view of God, of saying God is outside of time and both inside of time, which is beyond our full comprehension. And the Molinist takes it further to answer some of the objections and how that might work with regard to counterfactuals, middle knowledge, and those kinds of things. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah. You know, what I like with the eternal now is think about God existing alone as a Trinity apart from creation. So before, if you will, God creates, God exists in a state of affairs where nothing else exists, no time, no space, nothing else has been, no angels or demons, right? Nothing else exists. It's just God. I think that's the biblical view and what most Christians would affirm. So now if God's maximally great in that state, then God doesn't just know, well, there's no past to know at that point.
Right.
But he knows everything that he could make actual. And he knows all that would happen. And, you know, and this isn't a perfect analogy by any means, but I think by watching Avengers and Doctor Strange, we can at least start to get an idea how to make sense of this. You know, Doctor Strange looked at all these possible futures, is what he called them, when they're trying to defeat Thanos, right? And so he looked at all these different possible futures and he picked the only one in which he knew that the Avengers would defeat evil in the end. And so he actualized that one somehow. We don't know how for sure he did it, but he did it. Now, well, okay. So in that eternal, God's knowledge of that, so there's no time apart from creation. So I say, as Dr. Craig has made famous, God is timeless sans creation. So in that sans creation state, is God maximally great? Does God know everything? And if so, then I think you've got some form of Molinism. So I always say that the Kalam cosmological argument can help us understand even more about Molinism and God's knowledge here. So consider the fact that the rational inferences provided by the Kalam show that God exists in that static state of aseity in which the universe, you know, all nature, time, and space did not exist. So that is to say, logically prior to the beginning of the existence of the universe, God exists, and then to use temporal language, God creates the universe. Now, considering this static state of aseity, the question is raised, as I said earlier, is God maximally great in this state? I've got 3 questions. I call it the cosmological quiz. So question 1, is it true that God exists in a state of aseity logically prior to creating the universe and thus without the universe? Question 2, in this state of aseity, is God omnipotent? If so, does he possess the power to create creatures with libertarian freedom, even if he never does create them? Question 3. In this state of aseity, is God omniscient? If so, does he possess the knowledge of what these libertarian free creatures within his power to create, even if he never does create them? Does he possess the knowledge of how they would freely choose or what they would freely do? Those are your 3 questions. Now, if one answers no to any of the questions, then you might be a heretic. But if one answers yes to all of the above, then congratulations, then you're a Molinist. So I don't know if that helps.
No, that really does help. I need to, like I said before, I need to sit down and read through some of this while I'm listening back to your explanation of it, because that's the way I learn better. But I think you've made a good case for this, in understanding really the concept of middle knowledge is really the root of the Molinistic position. And it seems to me to be intuitively affirmable in the sense that, natural knowledge being what could happen, free knowledge being what will happen, and between that is ultimately what would happen if.
That's exactly right.
The counterfactuals
of
these things. So
yeah,
why would anybody deny that? In other words, help me understand, why would somebody say that middle knowledge doesn't exist?
It seems to me, I mean, at least Calvinists will deny it because they don't want Molinism to be true. And Molinism hinges on middle knowledge. Now, they're going to say, no, that's not the reason. Well, listen, if you're going to say that God has natural knowledge, then that means that God has knowledge of everything he could make actual. And then it means if God is omniscient, that God would also know, based on all the things that he never does, right, and all the things that he could do, he knows all that would happen if he actualized any of these other states of affairs. Any state of affairs that God could create, he knows all that would happen if. So the question then comes, is it even possible, logically possible, for God to create a creature who can choose between a range of options, each compatible with that image of God nature? I mean, to deny that seems to say God's not omnipotent, because that's a logically coherent sentence. There's no hidden metaphysical problems in it. And
so in the natural knowledge is different than middle knowledge insofar as when you say what could happen, you're saying what could happen in this world without any counterfactuals, or
no?
How is in other words, how is natural knowledge different from middle knowledge, if that makes sense?
I like to just break it down like this: natural knowledge. So, okay, this is God in his static state of aseity before he creates anything, right? Just the Trinity exists. In that state, God knows everything he could create, right? In that state, God knows everything he could create, right? Everything he could do, everything he could actualize, everything he could make actual. Also in that state, given all of God's options, right? Because he's omnipotent, given all of God's options, since he's omniscient, he knows all that would happen. So think of the fine-tuning argument for God's existence. That goes all the way back and describes the initial conditions of the Big Bang and how those initial conditions demonstrate that the universe is finely tuned and intelligently designed for human life today. All right, God could have fine-tuned those initial conditions otherwise. And if that's the case, I mean, that's why we call it the fine-tuning argument for intelligent design, because there was intelligence that went behind it. So he knew what would happen if he created that initial condition differently. Well, that's middle knowledge. If God knows what would have happened based on these other conditions, these constants and quantities, and he knows what would have happened if he created them that way, or one way instead of the other, then that is middle knowledge by definition. And so, yeah, basically you said it. It's got God's natural knowledge is everything he could actualize. God's middle knowledge is everything that would happen if he actualized any of these options. And then God's free knowledge is all that will happen in the actual world. Now, will doesn't magic. So if God knows that he could create a free creature, and God knows how the free creature would freely choose if he actualized the free creature, and then God creates the free creature. So now it goes from God knowing how the free creature would freely choose, God creates, and now God knows how the free creature will freely choose. Just because it went from would to will, the word freely doesn't magically disappear. You're still free in a libertarian sense.
Yeah. And if you would have chosen otherwise, then that's what he would have known. That's the way I've heard Craig describe it.
That's right. And I could spend an hour talking about that. Maybe that's a topic for another show.
Maybe so. But tell the audience how they can get a hold of you or find more of your materials before we close.
Yeah. freethinkingministries.com is the website where we, it's really an apologetics based apology and theology, apologetics and theology based website. And even the majority of apologetics arguments are really through the lens of libertarian freedom and Molinism and middle knowledge. So I encourage people, I mean, we talk on a range of options from theology, answering the problem of evil, showing how free will points to the existence of God. We love to talk about movies and show how they relate to theology. And I even talk about politics quite a bit. So I encourage people to go there, listen to our podcast. It's called the Free Thinking Podcast. And Free Thinking Ministries does have a YouTube channel. Right now, I've kind of been using it to store videos, but in the next couple months, we're going to be launching kind of what you're doing, and
Right.
you know, doing interviews and regularly scheduled weekly shows on YouTube, things like that. So I encourage people to subscribe to the channel and get ready for what's coming around the corner.
Well, awesome. Dr. Stratton, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come and visit with us. I will put in the show notes. Matter of fact, I already put in the show notes, freethinkingministries.com, for our listeners to go and learn more about you. Look forward to seeing more of your videos. I think you're a great thinker, a great free thinker, and you do a good job explaining Molinism from a non-Calvinistic perspective. And maybe we can get Kokol and you to come on and maybe have a discussion, or maybe you and Bignon, or one of these guys maybe can take on both sides of this issue. I think it would be really interesting to have you and Kokol in one broadcast, and then maybe you and Bignon in another broadcast, because it would contrast the Calvinists who affirm EDD, exhaustive divine determinism, versus those who do not, like Kokol. Yeah. That would be really interesting,
that would
I think,
be a
to
fun,
see how that would work.
Contrast, yeah.
Or well, even get Kokol and Bignon on together.
Let them argue.
That would be fun too, wouldn't it?
That would be interesting. I'd like to see them argue. Then I'll take the last man standing. But no, both those guys I highly respect. In fact, if I were going to change my mind and become a compatibilist, it would be because of Guillaume's work. I read his book, and some of his arguments really made me take a step back, and I had to work through it. And at the end, I'm like, yeah, he's wrong, right? He's wrong. But man, he made some good arguments that I really couldn't just dismiss and like, oh, well, we have an answer to that. I had to think things through for a long time, and really wrestled with it. And I think I exposed the problems in my dissertation, which isn't published yet. But that is to say, I highly respect him, and he's a thinker that needs to be taken seriously. And the same thing can be said with Greg Kokol. He's actually, I'd call him one of my heroes. I just think he's wrong on Molinism, on his rejection of Molinism. And I've told him that to his face on a couple of different occasions. We went to Israel together. Oh, and yeah, great guy. Just love the guy. And his book, Tactics, is, I mean, if you don't own the book Tactics, you're not an apologist. Or you're not seeking to influence culture. You know, it's just such a good book. He's recently published a revised version. It's bigger and it's expanded version. Highly recommend it. But yeah, both those guys, two of my favorite guys. We just disagree on a couple things.
Yeah. Well, and that's the iron sharpening iron. That's so important.
Right.
I hear you and Eli, for example, talking on your program, how cordial you are with each other. You love each other, obviously, as brothers.
Yep.
And that's the kind of thing I want to promote on our broadcast as well, is to say we can disagree without being disagreeable and parting ways. And you set a good example of that when you're talking to our Calvinistic friends, and showing respect. And the fact that you just mentioned earlier, when you read through Bignon's book, you're pushed to think through things that you hadn't thought through before.
Right. He sharpened me like iron, right?
Exactly. And so, and that's what's so important about this, not to label and dismiss somebody, not to marginalize, gaslight, all the kinds of things that sometimes we unfortunately see on the internet, but instead to look at the very best of our opponent's arguments and tackle that still man, like you said, versus the straw man, because then we're actually doing good apologetics. We're making good argumentations that are worth addressing. And I think you're setting a good example for that. So thank you, Dr. Stratton, for coming on to the program. And we hope to have you back again real soon.
Well, one final comment. I did graduate, or I did not graduate yet. I passed my PhD dissertation. I think
you're a doctor.
I think you can call me doctor, but I can't officially call myself doctor until graduation. That's
once you've been approved. I sit with Trinity on the board. When we're done and we approve them, we call them doctor from that point forward. Yep. So
all right.
As far as I'm concerned, you are Dr. Stratton.
All right. Well, I think you're the first one to officially call me Dr. Stratton in public. So I am honored. Thank you.
God bless, brother. We'll talk to you guys next time.